Well, let's start off. I'm only going to give a bit of introduction, so if people come after that, that's fine. So we've got a session on adaptation modelling for European policies and investments, which is a very broad topic. And I'll just explain a little bit about what we want to cover in that. And we have 4 really fantastic speakers this morning. So I am looking forward to the 4 talks that we have. And as I've said, we'll try and allow you to have some questions as we go through and also save a bit of time for the end. So in terms of, we're really trying to cover 2 areas or 2 end uses in this session. The first one is about EU and national policy support. And sometimes that will be using adaptation models in quite detailed analysis. And we'll have an example from Kees early on about road transport as a sort of example about that. But we recognize that in putting together, whether it's EU policy or national policy, that there is valuable information from adaptation models. At the same time, this second point, we talk to policymakers and policymakers say, well, sometimes we need things quickly. And that could be because we're being asked questions. It could be that the policy process is moving very quickly. So we also need to think a little bit about how we can support policymakers with rapid assessment adaptation modeling. And that may be taking existing material and interpreting it. It may be rapid models, but there's a great value there. And one of the examples of that is the Aqueduct model. And that's one thing that we're going to hear a talk from later on in the presentation. There's a lot of needs that we are also starting to identify where I think it's worth recognizing adaptation models need to start expanding. I mean, that's partly moving beyond technical adaptation. It's partly about where we can capture all the risks that, say, a national or a policymaker might be interested in. We tend to have lots and lots of good models in very specific areas, like floods, for example, and not so many models in areas such as ecosystems and ecosystem services. And then I think there's also a recognition that as we move forward and countries are starting to implement adaptation themselves, we end up with this complex space where we need to take on board what countries are already doing at the same time as looking what else can be done and using modeling to support that. So there's a greater need to think how we make our models real, which is really challenging, but it's going to be very important. And then the second area we're going to cover, which is sort of linked but also different, we're going to look at infrastructure. In particular, in terms of investments. Investments have a long lifetime, they involve lock-in, they are a priority for early investments. Now, sometimes that's where an organization such as the EU or the European Investment Bank or EBRD has a portfolio of investments and it wants to make them climate smart. People sometimes call that climate proofing, and that's one type of project. And there are already risk mechanisms in place and screening tools and detailed assessments that we can apply there. And we're going to hear some of that. And I think one of the things to recognize there is that involves wider issues than just the modeling environment as well. It involves using modeling to support national policy assessments, such as on climate uplifts for engineering. And I think one of our speakers will talk about that as well. Heard about decision making under uncertainty, that's a big focus. We are starting to see more interest in that. Sometimes we will want quite complex approaches, and we'll hear an example from the World Bank on its approach for looking at levels of detail and building that up over time. But also sometimes we'll want light touch approaches. And I think the thing I will end with before I start going to our first speaker is just to highlight that we have this sort of climate proofing focus, but if you look at the EU adaptation strategy and you look at what we need to do over the next decade, it's clear that we're going to have to make a lot more investment in adaptation itself. And so there's a great need to support that. And that starts to capture some of the issues we've heard about, moving to a systems approach, moving upstream, looking at wider issues and connectivity. And so I think there's an open question there about IS2 applications and what we can do. So that's it from me. I'm going to finish early and give us an extra couple of minutes. What I would like to do now is hand over to Kees. And ask if he would get his presentation together. So I will stop sharing my screen. And Kees, are you able to present now? Kees is a researcher at Deltares and is going to talk to us, I think, about modeling on the road network. Okay.
So Paul, thank you very much. Can you maybe confirm that you can see my screen and maybe also clearly hear me and see me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
That's great. So today I will be presenting you the OS Damage tool, which is a tool for rapid assessment of road network risk. And that was developed in the context of the project Coach. The objective of the tool is to support decision-making on road adaptation. And the unique feature of this tool is actually that we have one tool which can analyze the road network from the continental scale up to the very individual road segments, which might be the tiny alley behind your house. So we have one method for global to continental to local scale analysis, and it's all open source. You can download it from GitHub, and it helps you to do rapid assessment for floods at this stage. And in the future, we also plan to expand it to landslides and other, actually any other hazard which might threat the road network. So we also have a version which can do climate risk. So I think many interesting applications here, but I will mainly focus on the flood risk to the road network. So my presentation will be like this. I will introduce you a little bit to the method of the approach, and then show you some results of the stuff we have been doing in the Coach project. And then we'll point you at some ongoing research on indirect effects. Well, the first question would be, why would the existing tools that we have not be good enough for our purpose? Well, what we traditionally would do as flood risk modelers is we take a grid with exposure data, such as the Corrine or the Louisa land cover grid, overlay it with our flood risk data, and then do an assessment of flood risk for different land use classes, among which are roads. However, the resolution of these models is typically 100 by 100 meter, and that makes it very hard to do a detailed overview of roads, because road is typically 30 meter wide, so it's very hard to accurately represent that in the grid. Either you make the roads too wide, such as in the new Louisa set, or you do not see them at all, such as in the old Corrine versions. So that is why we chose to actually work with OpenStreetMap, which has a very high resolution, and it's a very complete data set of all the roads which are available in Europe. So what we did, we basically substituted the exposure data set from Corrine and Louisa and replaced it with the data from OpenStreetMap. However, we did not only change the exposure data, but also change the vulnerability data. So what is very important for roads is that every road is different. So a highway is very different from a trunk road, and of course, very different from that tiny alley behind your house. So we wanted to make damage curves which actually account for all these different characteristics of roads, such as the presence of street lighting, the number of lanes, and the road type. So what we did, we mined a lot of data on what would it actually cost to construct a road, and how much actually could this road be damaged from a flood. And that helped us to construct damage curves which are very tailored to the specific type of asset we are talking about. So what is the model doing? Basically, we cut whole of Europe in small pieces, and then we use parallel processing techniques to calculate the damage for all these pieces very rapidly. So for one NUTS 3 region, which is roughly the size of maybe a municipality or a part of a province, it takes a few minutes. And for all of Europe, that will take then maybe a day or a couple of days to do the assignment for all the roads in Europe. So that's a really crazy amount of data. And then if we have done that, we do a classic analysis of the risk per road segment. So what can we do with this? Well, of course, you can do the same as we already could do before with the other approaches. So you could use our model to do an analysis of the classic European-wide risk. So we know roughly how much damage to roads we can expect for the entire continent. And actually, we found a surprising thing here, that because we thought we would we would underestimate the risk using the old grid-based approaches, but now we actually found that our new approaches, which are results are shown in the third panel, that actually they gave lower damages. So it was very useful to to this validation of the model? Well, what we also can do is disaggregate the results by region. And you can here, for example, see that the Alpine region is quite a hotspot here. However, what is really nice and what we couldn't do before is that we can really now pinpoint those damages to individual road segments. So here you will see the map of Europe showing the motorway and the trunk road network. And we can really see that the damage in the Alpine regions is caused by damages to a couple of road segments here at the border between Swiss, Italy and France. Similarly, we saw, for example, flood hotspots in the Danube River basin. So that is really nice of the new method. We really can do continental scale assessment, but then look into the results at the level of individual road segments. And that also gives a direct perspective of action for our method for national road operators or European-wide strategic planners. Here you can see another demonstration of the resolution of the model. Here we verify the model with an observed flood event in Deggendorf. And you can see how accurate we are actually able to tell you which road segment will be damaged. Actually, there was in the scientific discussion on our publication, there was a reviewer who pointed us at how important this actually is that we are now able to do this. Because there was a previous project called RoadApt, and there they really emphasized that we should do this kind of assessment for individual road segments. And we think we are now the first group who is actually able to do this, an assessment for all of Europe, but on a very high resolution scale. So we also did a study on the global scale. So that's also a possibility. We did a study for Europe and then hotspot identification, as I just showed you. And we also did for the coach project a study where we studied how the flood risk might develop for different climate change scenarios. So this was all on the direct damage modeling, which improved a lot. But of course, it is much more interesting also to look into the possibilities for studying indirect damage. And indirect damage meaning the damage you can expect from not so much the damage to the infrastructure itself, but more like the societal disruption that is followed by a road network disruption. And the nice thing of our model is that it also has the potential to do these kind of studies. So besides that, we still want to improve on the direct damage side, so application to more hazards, working with higher resolution flood data, doing more local case studies. We really want to focus on pushing this development of indirect damage modeling. And we can do that with exactly the same model setup as we just described. So for example, what can we do? We can do a criticality analysis. So as to indicate what are the most vulnerable links in my network, which are not only vulnerable, but also very critical in my national road network. So we could study how the transport flows over the network would be, then combine that with our knowledge on which road segments can be damaged. We are working on more advanced indicators to express this performance. And we are also playing around with simulating individual flood events and looking at the combined effect. Because you can imagine if you have two important north and south corridors in your country, it is mainly troublesome if both corridors are disrupted at the same time. So their stochastic sampling becomes a very important aspect. And this is all from the perspective of national road operators, but what we also did is looking into a single factory. But let me first show you how this could look like for a national road network. This is also work done by a colleague of me for the coach project. So here you would see the road network of Albania. And what we actually do here is we simulate all the different floods on the network. You can see them on the right-hand side with all the fancy colors. Those represent the floods that can happen in Albania. And we actually simulate what happens if multiple of these floods happen at the same time. Then we summarize all this information and make these kind of graphs, which are called percolation graphs. And there we can actually see that Albania has a very steep curve. It's the blue one, meaning that in Albania, only a couple of floods can already disrupt a really big percentage of the connectivity of the network. So if the curve goes up very steep, the road network in this country is not very resilient. If you compare that, for example, to Sweden, the blue line, then you can see that it goes much flatter, indicating that in Sweden actually many floods could happen and still the network is not really disrupted a lot. So we've done this for multiple countries and trying to scale that up for even larger areas in Europe now. Now, what this also can do is help us to do hotspot identification in the country. So we would sample different floods. And here, for example, you see an example where we, on the left-hand side, on the bottom of the screen, the blue one, we sample 5 floods. But actually, those 5 floods together wouldn't even do any serious damage to the road network of Austria. Whereas there are also combinations of floods shown in the right-hand side, in the purple dot. If those floods would happen at the same time, they would cause a large disruption of the road network. So this could actually help the road operator to prioritize the links or the road segments that he should flood-proof to guarantee more resilience in the country. Well, we also did this analysis for one factory where we studied the supply chain from one factory. On the right-hand side, you would see the preferred route from the factory to the supplier, or from the supplier to the factory. And you can see that we simulate different floods, and each flood would require taking an alternative route to the factory with a certain additional travel time. And then we assessed if this travel time goes beyond certain limits. So our ambition is to further develop this model to a tool where we can really do direct assessment, much better than we could do before, more accurate, but also combine it with the prioritizing indirect effects. And both things together could really help to do targeted investments in road infrastructure in Europe, which will protect us also if the climate change would make flooding worse. So thank you very much. And I hand over to Paul.
Thank you, Kees. That was excellent. And you stuck to time. We have one question that I'd like to ask. We have a question about what it would take to use this approach to look at the trans-European network, the TEN-T corridors. So you know, whether this could be applied to those sort of major European investments to sort of increase connectivity across Europe.
Yeah, that would be definitely possible, and I think even not so hard to do because we already have all the flood risk data attributed to the road network. But then I also think for the TEN network, it would be interesting to look into the indirect effects. So what happens to the network performance or to this unique trade corridor if a flood disrupts a couple of links in this network? So yeah, we could definitely do that, and it's a very interesting question, especially if there is, and I think there is for the TEN network, some more economic data which helps us to prioritize the links. So what are really the critical parts of the networks that shouldn't fail?
Yeah, and a question from me. I mean, this is fantastic, and it's sort of advancing our knowledge on risks. But what about the adaptation side? I mean, are there plans to go and look at adaptation? And if you did that, how might you do that in this modeling environment?
Yeah, so what the tool does, it shows you the most critical parts of the network for floods or against floods. So those would actually be the links that you would target your adaptation investments into. So we could actually also study what would happen to your network if you would improve this road segment. So if it can no longer be flooded, and you will directly see how much increase of network performance you have if you implement the measure. So I think it really helps to target your adaptation investments.
Yes, no, I agree with that. And I'm sure the question the policymakers will always ask, though, is how much is it going to cost me to do that, and what are the benefits that I'll receive? So I guess that's one for the future. But absolutely fantastic, and we're on time. So what I'd like to do is ask Kees to stop sharing his screen now, if that's possible, Kees. And if I could ask our next speaker to get ready. Is it Umit or Umit? Umit. I'd like to invite you to...
Yes, Umit.
Umit, I got it, okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And Umit Tanna is a leading water management expert, also working at Deltares, and he's going to give us a run through one of the decision support tools that we've mentioned. And I think this is the way that it's going. It's going towards sector-specific guidance that incorporates uncertainty, but also allows you to go through different levels and see when you can do this in a more light touch or screening-based approach, and when you need the detail. And so, Umit, I will hand over to you, and you'll give us a talk on the World Bank Decision Tree Framework. And I'll let you know if you get to about 12 or 13 minutes, I'll remind you, just so that you can go to your conclusions. But we're right on time. Thank you.
Okay, sounds perfect. First of all, do you hear me well and see me and my slides? Do you see the slides?
Yes and yes.
Yes, great. Okay, hello everyone. First of all, thanks Paul for the introduction. I'm also very glad to be here. And I'll be talking a little bit more, as Paul said, on the climate proofing side of investments, long-term investments, and decision frameworks to support basically long-term planning decisions. The decision tree framework developed by the World Bank in 2015 is one of the methodologies that is used for this purpose. So I'll start with like a brief overview of the approach. Show a couple of slides on our recent case study that we have done in Deltares. I won't go into much detail, and then I'll a little bit talk about the tools, what we are thinking in terms of the tools that we are developing to make these type of approaches more approachable by non-academics and the consulting world, basically to efficiently apply these techniques for different studies. So the decision tree framework, as Paul actually mentioned a lot of things that I wanted to say, so I won't repeat it again here, but we need guidance, structured guidance for long-term investments and a proper assessment of risks. So this is very crucial, both for Europe and elsewhere in other regions of the world. And DTF, the decision tree framework, is designed for this purpose by efforts from the University of Massachusetts and the World Bank team. It's a hierarchical approach, which is basically starts with simple, rapid tools, rapid assessments, and goes into more advanced techniques only if needed. So it's designed for the practitioners in mind, considering that we have limited budgets and limited time in projects. It's also a bottom-up approach. What we mean by bottom-up is we focus on the decisions rather than the scenarios or predictions. And also, Paul is here, and also Robert, I guess, also is here. Like they also, for the Asian Development Bank, developed a similar climate proofing methodology. And there's also climate risk-informed decision analysis framework, CRIDA. So decision tree framework is not the only approach, but there are other bottom-up techniques. As I recall, also the hydropower association, International Hydropower Association, also developed recently a similar technique also to look at long-term investments. So these two kinds of approaches are becoming more common in different places for helping policymakers to identify risks and manage risks to develop solutions for adaptation. So I won't go into, again, repeat much, but this is the heart of this DTF. It's a bottom-up approach, and it's based on a technique called decision scaling. So the heart of this approach is to basically first identify what our system is vulnerable to, and then use additional sources of information such as climate projections to basically to say something about the likelihood of those vulnerabilities, and then basically develop solutions based on that. This is different than the traditional approach where we are more interested in predictions and scenarios and precise estimates of what could happen in the future. That's starting with the top-down global models. So we are not taking that approach, but we are taking more a bottom-up vulnerability-based approach in DTF. Simply DTF has 4 stages. As I said earlier, it's a hierarchical process. In the first step, we start with looking at if our system, if our project or system is vulnerable to climate, and is a very quick decision, usually by the project managers or with the stakeholders. And if we see that there's climate is really an important factor, we go to our second phase, which is the desktop analysis, where we use the simple system models to conduct sensitivity analysis and look into elasticity and basically to figure out like what are the most important factors, climatic and non-climatic factors that could that we have to consider for the project. And if climate is important, we go to the third phase, which we call the climate stress test, where we use more advanced techniques such as stochastic weather generators, more sophisticated models, sampling techniques to basically look a wide range of plausible features and to basically map the vulnerability of the system across the uncertainty space and to see where our system fails or where our system performs robust. And after that phase, naturally comes the risk management based on what we see as the vulnerabilities. We propose solutions to improve system robustness. This could be through more staged decisions, operational decisions, or more large-scale investments such as building new reservoirs or nature-based solutions and so on. I want to show a couple of slides on our recent work in Chancay-Lambayeque Basin in Peru. So this was a very challenging area to work with because it's very much influenced by ENSO patterns, and both suffers from very severe flooding as well as prolonged droughts. So what we want to achieve in this basin is to basically look at, first of all, identify the vulnerability of the current system, and then to look at possible investments in upstream involving nature-based solutions, but also in the mid-basin, some new reservoirs or groundwater use, extended groundwater use, this type of measures to basically improve the robustness of the system to flooding and droughts. So I won't talk much, but just to show the this 4 phases. The phase 1 was we get together with the stakeholders and define basically the critical thresholds and what is important for us in terms of performance targets for irrigation, domestic supply, and flood control. And we carry out the sensitivity analysis, considering a wide range of different factors, climatic and non-climatic factors, such as changes in precipitation temperature, increases in demand, interbasin water transfers, and sediment accumulation in the existing reservoirs, and so on. And we basically wanted to focus after this on irrigation demand, precipitation, and temperature change, as both because they were the critical uncertainties for both for the water supply side and also for flooding. And the third phase, the stress testing, we built a stochastic weather generator to capture, basically to represent the natural low frequency variability due to ENSO in the basin, but also like be able to represent stochastic, the month-to-month or year-to-year variability and the weather patterns and long-term climatic trends in precipitation and temperature. And we basically generated a large set of climate sequences and run these through hydrology and water system models. And later on, as you see here, like we looked at the system vulnerability in domestic supply, irrigation supply, and flooding, which I don't show in the slide. But yeah, basically, what we see was, especially irrigation was very vulnerable to long-term climate changes. As you see, it's all reds here, which is like performing, underperforming, and we cannot meet the thresholds. In the fourth phase, we looked at a portfolio of options, 8 portfolios, including nature-based solutions, new dams, and also like increased groundwater usage. And we evaluated them based on how much they improve the system robustness, and also in terms of if they're cost-effective options. So basically, I won't go into detail, but this project demonstrates a nice, I think, example of on a basin scale how this type of an approach can be effectively applied. I think we have several minutes, I guess, so I want to move on to the next section, which is like the tools or the supporting tools that we are currently developing to basically make the DTF and similar approaches more applicable, and to be able to mainstream these approaches for outside the academia and especially in the consulting world. So I will talk a little bit about the guidance, the further guidance we are developing, a technique, and also show you what we want to do with the global data sets and these global data platforms, and how we can link those to decision tree framework and similar techniques. So first, we are working on a taxonomy-based approach, basically to give better structured guidance at the early phases of the analysis to practitioners based on the purpose of the study, lifetime, and flexibility if it is if the options considered are irreversible options that are very costly to change, or they're like easily modified over time, or what is the level of risk tolerance that we can cope. Is it a very critical investment for the public, or is it something that we see an opportunity to gain more benefits on the long run? So basically using this taxonomy-based classification to give a better guidance on method selection and how to apply these methods to different types of problems. I know, for instance, like in the ADB climate proofing work, Paul and Robert's work, there is also some level of taxonomy-based advising is presented. So we want to basically pick based on that and a little bit improve on what has been done. Another thing which is, I think, very crucial is these data analysis toolboxes or resilience analysis toolboxes, which could use a wide range of global data sets that's already available. So we are building like a simple tool on top of Deltares' Blue Earth platform, which is a global data set platform and analysis platform. And what we want to do is to basically to put some quick analysis, statistical and visual analysis approaches within this Blue Earth platform to look into, quickly look into like past trends and historical data, temporal variability, intra-annual, interannual, low frequency variability, spatial differences, and as well as extremes. And we also want to do similar type of analyses for climate projections. So this could be tailored for these type of risk proofing methodologies such as DTF, and it could provide a nice interface on the quick way to basically evaluate the risks, existing uncertainties related to climate.
Umit, you have maybe 1 to 2 minutes left, please.
Okay, great. So my last slide. So also another tool is a response surface visualizer, like as you see showed previously, like these climate response surfaces. How can we generate them very quickly in different projects using Excel files? This is also a tool that we want to integrate into our practical set of toolkits, risk and resilience analysis toolkits. Yeah, so for today, this was all my talk, and if we have time, I can take questions, or later on, if you want to get in touch, please don't hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have a question for you. I can either read it to you, or you can look at the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen.
If you can read for some reason, I cannot see the chat at the moment.
Yeah, if you can stop sharing your screen as well.
Yeah, maybe in that case, that would be easier.
But the question is, well, when you're reviewing the cost-benefit analysis of nature-based solutions, what metrics are you using, and are these standardized? So it's a nice, easy question to start with.
Yeah. So for the current analysis we have done, we basically focused on more conventional metrics such as net present value, internal rate of return, and more conventional metrics. But yeah, it's I agree. It's an important question, and it's also like there's a lot of indirect benefits which doesn't show up in these conventional metrics. So yeah, in our one of our conclusions was like more analysis is needed to basically be able to model and consider indirect benefits such as reduction of carbon emissions, as well as other benefits to the society. So that's a good question, I think, and so far we haven't basically looked into more detailed ways to consider those aspects.
Thank you. Can you stop sharing your screen? I still see it.
Yes, I'm trying to. Okay, now I see. I think
you need to go to the top of your screen, and it will appear.
Yes.
And if I could invite Rob Wilby to take the floor. Rob's Professor of Hydroclimatic Modelling, I think, at Loughborough University. Rob, I can see you. Are you okay to go?
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, and we can see your screen.
Okay, I'm like yesterday, I'm not going to live dangerously with the video because of the bandwidth. So I shall just show my slides, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion. My talk's going to adopt a very practical approach. I think we all recognize now that climate risk assessment and adaptation planning has entered the mainstream. So there's a considerable amount of effort globally going into how to make these analyses more streamlined, how to enhance their value added, how to make the life of the practitioner easier. So what I'm going to do is share just some insights that I've gained over probably the last decade or so of looking at very many climate risk assessments and adaptation plans from all over the world, and to just point to some things that we might be doing as a community to, as I say, enhance the value added and to better mainstream these approaches. Let me begin by picking up a point that I think Paul has already made about the need to think more upstream, to think more about the context within which the adaptation planning is occurring. If we look at this coastal road in Vietnam, and we're seeking to adapt this to climate change, we're seeking to improve the transport network, we might initially concentrate on the flood risks to the road itself through runoff from the surrounding landscape. And by doing that, by concentrating on how to improve the drainage of the road, we might actually have missed the wider and more serious contextual risk from sea level rise. So I just use that as a very simple example to make the point of the need to move more upstream and to think more laterally in our overall approach to adaptation planning and assessment. And that philosophy was really captured in the paper that's been mentioned before. Paul, myself, and others have been thinking about how to strengthen adaptation and climate risk management within the Asian Development Bank's investment portfolio. And I've highlighted here in red the area of work that most projects tend to focus on. That's the highly analytical bit, where we concentrate on obtaining the climate information, doing the downscaling, doing the vulnerability assessment, doing the impacts assessment, sometimes evaluating and comparing adaptation options, and then eventually suggesting the preferred set of measures. But actually there's a whole raft of other activities that we should be contemplating that are upstream. We should be thinking about the broader context nationally of what a country is seeking to achieve in terms of its long-term goals for climate adaptation. At the project level, we should be thinking about what is the actual development or adaptation outcome that we are seeking to achieve. That should be very much at the top of the page and should then really help to focus our thinking downstream. And by focusing more on those upstream decisions, we're able to refine and add value to the downstream climate risk and adaptation analysis. That's the heart of this overall flow diagram. And as I said, I've been fortunate to look at many climate risk and adaptation plans over the years, and I share with you here a little checklist as I've developed to help me evaluate the utility of these assessments and to help me think in a more systematic way about the value added by the work. And there are essentially 7 or 8 elements that we might be looking for in a strong climate risk and adaptation assessment. We of course want a clear statement of the key vulnerabilities and risks faced by the project elements. We need to state basic information about the timescales over which the investment is intended to deliver benefits, the types of climate variability that one might encounter, and other major boundary assumptions. We also need to be quite clear about what we're trying to achieve in terms of the benefits to who, what are the ancillary or co-benefits of the adaptation options, which could actually bolster the case for their implementation. And then we need a whole raft of criteria and metrics to help us compare various options in a systematic way. And we also, wrapped all around this, we need to be using climate information in an appropriate way. And the previous speaker, I think, also shares the same view that we shouldn't really be beginning with the climate information itself. That enters the whole analysis much further on in the process and should be used for stress testing, comparing the performance of different options under a plausible range of climate change. And I've highlighted here 3 areas in red which tend to be on the weaker side within the majority of assessments. Many assessments fail to properly benchmark the adaptation measures against a condition where there is either no climate change or with climate change, with and without adaptation. So appropriate benchmarking is a key element. Often the treatment of costs is superficial or could be or is partial. We need more detailed working and analysis and the assumptions behind the costing of each measure. And given the huge uncertainty that surrounds all of this, and the fact of life that we don't know for sure what the regional or local climate is going to be, we should be undertaking a range of sensitivity analyses to really stress test the measures under a plausible range of conditions. We can also make life easier for the practitioner if we work with existing procedures. And here I show the flow diagram for roads in Vietnam. Engineers have to follow a clearly defined set of tasks as they design the road and implement climate change allowances to protect the system or the piece of road against a credible amount of climate change. And essentially this is following a conventional engineering approach where we're looking at the occurrence of extremes, designing to a specific level, but the climate change allowance is then being factored into the design to uplift or strengthen the design using an existing set of tables or protocols. So for example, engineers will be familiar with the return period concept, and there'll be design standards for specific road types. So one road might be designed for a 20-year return period event, and by using the climate model information, we can analyze how the key design variable, in this case the one-day rainfall maximum, how that might change in the future over the region of interest. And here I just give you some illustrative values of how that quantity changes for different time horizons. So for example, over the period 2016 to 35, that 20-year return period event could increase in magnitude by 25%. And note again, there are some embedded assumptions in a table like this. All the values have been rounded up to 5% to underline the fact that this is highly uncertain. We are turning the dial up throughout by taking the highest credible value from the ensemble. Now that's something that we might like to discuss later, but it depends on how precautionary the design has to be. And it may be that by erring on the side of precaution, we're factoring in some contingency for the uncertainty in climate change and embedding that within the design standard. So what I've just talked about applies to an individual structure. Umit has already shown us a really nice example of a response surface, and these are now being routinely used in all sorts of ways. Here I give an example of a recent study looking at the use of response surfaces to test flood allowances at the national level for Ireland. How the climate change allowance performs given the uncertainty in the range of climate model scenarios. And if you look at any one of these graphs and you concentrate on the dashed line, which shows the 20% allowance as the safety margin, the dots show the proportion of models that fall beneath that level, and it shows the extent to which that 20% allowance is sufficient in any given river basin, which reflects the different types of catchment that we might see across a country. And by and large, in this case, we can see that the 20% allowance covers the uncertainty in the majority of the models in the majority of catchments. So there we might argue that we have this simple rule of thumb where we'd say actually a 20% allowance in the flood magnitude protects against the majority of model projections across the majority of catchments. So might be a workable use rule of thumb that an engineer could apply nationally. I also add this little PS, a reminder that outside of Europe and North America, often we're also seeking to identify affordable adaptation measures, low-cost measures that can be implemented within some of the most vulnerable communities in some of the most rapidly growing cities on the planet. And again, we can use quite simple tools, in this case a dummy regression analysis, to identify which interventions, such as changing the roofing material, use of insulation, use of shade, or other measures, is most effective at reducing the extreme temperatures within the home. And in this case, we can see that changing the roofing material and enhancing the insulation improves the indoor temperatures, but there are also going to be some trade-offs between improving the conditions during the day and at night. But this is just as a reminder to us all that we, in many cases, should be thinking about the simple and affordable measures at the local level.
Hi, Rob. Paul, you've got 1 to 2 minutes left, please.
That's great. So on to the final slide and the conclusions. Paul asked me to jot down a wish list for the next 5 years. So as a practitioner, what might I like to see to make my life easier when undertaking or evaluating climate risk and adaptation assessments? 4 things would be on my shopping list. The first would be an appeal to the climate modelling centres to make more user-friendly portals to allow easier and more rapid access to new scenarios. And in my mind, one of the best examples of this is the KNMI Climate Explorer. We really need more tools like this to enable a wider base of people to rapidly access climate model information. We also need to continue as a community to develop frameworks which help us to use climate model information in smarter ways. We need to be moving away from the predict and act paradigm to one in which we use climate model information to evaluate the performance of different adaptation measures. I think many speakers throughout this workshop have emphasized the need for a more multivariate approach to adaptation. We need to take a more holistic approach, and storylines are an ideal way in which we can think beyond just the climate threats, but also weave in some of the socio and economic context. And finally, above all, I think what we really need is a lot more guidance on how to undertake rapid economic appraisal and costing of adaptation options. I think here there's a real need to develop tools and resources in this particular area. So at that point, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That's excellent. And I have some questions, but I think we'll wait until the end just to make sure we start our next talk on time. Thank you again. And I hope if you can stop sharing your screen now, we can hopefully go and hopefully Philip is on the line. Hi, Philip, I can see you.
Hello, yes, I'm on the line.
Thank you. Brilliant, Philip. And Philip's going to give us a talk about the Aqueduct model. Fantastic, we can see you and we can see your screen. So if I can hand over to you, Philip.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's really great to be able to speak at this event. I really appreciate that this is going on in this online setting. Today I'm going to be talking about Aqueduct Floods, which is a free-to-use, simple-to-use web-based tool for assessing flood risk today and in the future. And it's part of a suite of tools developed by the World Resources Institute called the Aqueduct Tools Suite. This particular tool, Aqueduct Floods, has been developed by the Free University of Amsterdam together with the World Resources Institute and several other institutes who you see on this initial slide. So what does the Aqueduct Floods tool do? In a nutshell, I said it before, it allows any user to very simply go online and carry out a risk analysis, a flood risk analysis at national, subnational or basin level. And the processes that we're trying to incorporate are encapsulated on this figure here. So it allows a user to look at inland flooding from the rivers, from pluvial processes upstream, but also to look at coastal flooding from the sea downstream. And it also looks at changes in exposure, like we see in the front of this figure here. So different kinds of land uses are incorporated within this modeling tool. It allows us to make projections into the future, and the three main paths that we project into the future are the following. The tool allows us to look at climate change, especially in the case of river flooding, to look at changes in precipitation and extreme precipitation into the future and how that plays out into enhanced or indeed less river flooding, but also sea level rise when we're looking at those coastal floods. We also use projections of socio-economic change, so growth in population, land use change, GDP into the future. And importantly, for the aspect on coastal flooding, we also incorporate global projections of land subsidence, which is especially important for these global and EU deltas and estuaries. So this is a little bit on the high abstract level, let's say. I think the easiest way to try to demonstrate this is just to go through some slide shots to give a demonstration of the tool. So this is basically one of the initial screens that a user would land on. This is simply showing our hazard layers, actually. So what the user see here is we're seeing the area centered around Germany, and we see a flood hazard map. So that's just showing the area which could be flooded and also the depth of those floods for floods of different magnitudes, different return periods, like we talked about in that last presentation. And all of this data can be visualized on screen, but can also be downloaded to any user who may want to do their own analysis with this. So as you can see here, a user can choose different flood magnitudes. We also have different scenarios for the future. So now we're looking at the baseline, so the current conditions, but we have projections out towards 2080, and also for different climate scenarios using RCPs, and also using different climate models. We switch now to the moving from the hazard to the risk tab. And I just want to give one demonstration of some of the capabilities of the tool, but certainly not going into all of those capabilities. So here we see an example for the Rhine Basin. You can see in those red boxes on the left that here we've selected to do a risk analysis for riverine flooding. And the indicator of risk that we're using here is urban damage. So damage, economic damage in urban areas. Down at the bottom then, this is where the adaptation path starts to come in. The user can prescribe a protection level, as in what is the current protection level that is afforded within that region. And here I've just selected 250 years. So this would mean that the Rhine Basin is protected against 250-year floods, for example, by dikes, levees, and so forth. Now there's a whole sort, if we do that, then there's a whole bunch of results that will come out. I just want to show this level here, which is probably the top level result. This is the expected annual damage for this particular scenario that we've chosen. And we see that, well, we see in 2010, that's our baseline estimate of 760 million. And then we can see that going up into the future under our climate and socioeconomic change scenarios. I think an interesting aspect of this tool is that we can then break that down into the different drivers, so causes of that increase in risk. So for example, here, those blue boxes on the left, what we see there is a total change from the baseline period into the future as in terms of economic damage. And then if you look to those red and orange boxes, plots, basically that's breaking that down into the attribution to climate signal and the socioeconomic signal. As I say, we have different scenarios, so coupled to the RCPs, the SSPs, the socioeconomic and climate change scenarios, we have the 3 different scenarios within the tool, and the user can also look at different indicators. Here we look at urban damage, but we can also look at the affected population and the affected GDP. So I now move on to coastal flooding. Here again, we're seeing this landing page with a hazard map in the background, now centered around France. And you can see here that there's an option for the user with the tick, which allows you either to look at flood hazard with or without subsidence. And if we then flick through to the risk aspect, well, we can see a very similar screen. Here we're looking at France for a future scenario, and we can see that without subsidence. On the top right, in the red box, we can see the current expected annual damage of about 79 million and increasing very rapidly into the future. If we then click tick on this subsidence, we can then get those results if we include the influence of subsidence. The last part of the functionality that I want to show is where we really move towards that risk reduction or climate adaptation part. So here I'm showing a quick demonstration for the country of Denmark, and we're looking now at river flooding. What we see here is, as I told you before, the user can then select what the current protection level. So here that's the 40. So this would mean that we assume that this area is protected currently against the 40-year return period flood. But the user can then set a design protection level that they would want to achieve in the future. And here I've selected a 100-year flood. So this basically means that levees, dikes, etc. would be raised in the future to protect against a 100-year flood. Again, there's many settings that can be changed and there's many results, but the bottom line number is this one. So this is the cost-benefit ratio which comes out of this particular assessment. So 0.8, meaning that the costs in this case are lower than the benefits. And I want to emphasize, going back to what Rob stated, this is not, there are many uncertainties in this. So this tool, it's a global tool intended for really initial analyses of identifying areas where one may want to consider these options. But if you really want to go down to the project level, then of course more local in-depth knowledge and studies would be required. So just a few example uses and/or users of this tool. We've been using this in several large-scale studies looking at large-scale analyses. Sorry, I just went out to the wrong screen here. So many studies looking at this large-scale agenda setting. So this is an example of a study for the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, where basically we were looking at risk projections into the future under, let's say, business as usual scenarios, so assuming that little or no adaptation takes place, and there you see this trend upward in the flood risks. And then we're trying to look at how one could actually bend that trend downwards by looking at different ambition levels or different levels of climate adaptation. And this is really, we use these kinds of studies to try to work towards contributing to things like the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, the Sendai framework, and so forth. It's really been useful in collaborations with people like World Bank and regional development banks, national governments, for carrying out first level analyses and assessments of investment options. So I think an example of this would be a cooperation that we had probably 7 or 8 years ago between our University of Deltares and the World Bank Africa Region Disaster Management Team. Back then we didn't have this tool, but we had all of the complicated models behind the tool. The World Bank at the time was trying to develop a national flood risk management implementation plan with the country of Nigeria, and they wanted some first assessments of investment options from us. We were able to do this, but of course it took several weeks to months to be able to prepare that data, whereas now the exact same analyses can be carried out in a few matter of seconds by those users themselves to get this first screen. A couple of other examples of uses that we know of this particular tool. So several private companies have informed us that they're using it, for example, to assess supply chain risks. We are aware of several insurance and/or reinsurance companies who use this to get a screening of potential future changes across the risk portfolio, and also NGOs using this in a different sense, more in an awareness raising and training kind of way. So here would be the wish list, or what's needed in the next 5 years or so. This tool at the moment only looks at that adaptation for river flooding. So something that I think we need to also incorporate is these kinds of tools for coastal flooding. And all that we're showing here in terms of adaptation options is that raising of dikes and levees. Obviously, that's one option, and there's a whole host of options that could be taken, including moving people from the area, building differently, so building in a more commensurate way with flooding, nature-based solutions, and also a lot of those more low technology solutions that were mentioned in the last presentation. So they are things that could be worked on in the coming years. We're now looking also at either river flooding or coastal flooding, whilst we know that a lot of the really big flood disasters occur due to the interaction of those two processes, or compound flooding as it's called. So we would like to see more studies looking at that aspect. And I think it's been mentioned in several of the presentations already, but the need for this more integrative or multi-hazard risk type of assessment. So not just looking at flooding, but looking at measures that could be taken which reduce our risk or increase our resilience across a whole host of measures, of hazards. And then finally, this is a very coarse tool for that first screening. And I think that we need more scalable tools for making assessments at a higher granularity. For the last slide, this was just one of those tools that I've been describing. So Aqueduct Floods. There's a whole range of tools in this Aqueduct suite. For example, the Aqueduct Water Risks Atlas, which is looking mainly at more drought-related indicators, and the Aqueduct Food tool, which is looking at all kinds of variables and assessments related to food production, food use, etc. So that brings me to the end. Thank you again. And if there's time, I'll open for questions.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was excellent. So we have one question for you, and then I'll probably invite Rob back as well to ask him a question. So the question for you, Philip, is you may be able to see it on the chat function, but how to address the wide range of uncertainty on future sea level rise. I suppose particularly because that uncertainty seems to be increasing a little bit more at the moment. And then I'll go back to the question for Rob afterwards. But
yeah, good question. So, I mean, how we've dealt with that in this particular tool is that firstly, we have used, projections from different RCPs, 3 different RCPs in this case. But then also, I didn't show it here, but if you actually were to go into the tool, there is an uncertainty, you can get the uncertainty bounds from using the 5th and the 95th percentile range of those projections. So that's how we deal with it here. Of course, one could increase those number of scenarios, etc.
Yeah, no, and that's really useful, Rob. If you can come on, Rob. I mean, I have to say your point about the national standards is very important. I was talking to European Investment Bank the other week, and they said actually national standards are a barrier to adaptation if countries haven't put in an uplift already, because then people just say, well, I'm meeting the national standard, why do I need to do more? So it's quite interesting where I think we're starting to see a linkage between the adaptation modelling and the policy. But you have a very specific question, which is if you can suggest some ideas, some practical ideas, or key features of rapid economic assessment tools that you've sort of highlighted.
Okay, so if I can just respond to the point about the national standards, I think the key point here is that national standards provide the community with an entry point. They're not the solution per se. They provide an entry point within which state-of-the-art climate risk assessment and evaluation can be mainstreamed within day-to-day practice, and different countries have different approaches to that national standards. But as an entry point, I think is the key remark. Going back to the rapid economic appraisal, I have to be careful here because this is way outside my skill set. From my perspective, I think if it doesn't already exist, I think a global meta-analysis of approaches to to look at what works well and has been applied in other places would be a useful start. I know that some have tried to compile inventories of costs of adaptation features that tend to reoccur in many designs. Like there's only so many ways in which you can build a culvert. There are certain design features, for example, which may have quite well understood and recognizable costs. Okay, labor costs and things are going to vary locally, etc., etc. Materials will vary, but how far we can go down that line of having sort of almost menus of categories of commonly used design features, and that might include nature-based solutions as well, where at least if we don't get the dollar cost, we get a relative cost of these measures, but that is scaled and relative within the nation itself. I think that's all I would suggest.
No, thank you, Rob. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pose the last question to Philip and then close the session so that we'll overrun by 1 or 2 minutes, but that's all. I don't know if you can see, Philip, the question in the chat function already. If not, then it's just a question about the SSPs. Can you see that or not?
I can see it, yeah. It's a very good question, actually. And within, I have to say, within the development of this tool, so the question is about which SSPs are used. We've used 3 different combinations of RCPs and SSPs within that tool. And you are right that within that business as usual scenario, as it's named here, is using SSP2 in a combination with RCP 8.5. There were many discussions actually around this as we developed it together with a whole bunch of users. This is how we decided to go on it. But I think actually as we head towards the future, it would be important within these tools to also add the options to call up any of those combinations. And indeed, we do have the data to be able to do that behind that. And in the papers that we published, also we look at that full range of combinations. Because it's always a balance, right, between providing a whole host of numbers and data, which can then quickly become unmanageable to somebody who wants a more simple tool, and giving all of those scenarios. So we're trying to walk that fine line, but it's certainly difficult. Yes,
no, absolutely. Okay, so what I would like to do now is just close the session. I'd like to thank all of our 4 speakers. I'd also encourage you, if there's anything that you've seen that you think that looks interesting, send an email to somebody else or make contact. And I think we have an hour now for lunch. And then there are some tutorials that will be going on. And then I would strongly encourage you to come to the final session, which starts at 4 o'clock, final plenary, where we're actually try and wrap up and get some concrete conclusions, and also seek to get your views into adaptation modelling and into some of the things that might be of relevance for the Commission in its new adaptation strategy. So thank you all again. That was really interesting. Thank you. And hopefully see you all later. Okay, bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.